It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's talk with Dr. Bruce Perry on healing and building resilience in the aftermath of a mass shooting. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Perry has been an active teacher, clinician, and researcher in children's mental health and the neurosciences, holding a variety of academic positions. His work on the impact of abuse, neglect, and trauma on the developing brain has impacted clinical practice, programs, and policy across the world. Dr. Perry is the co-author of The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, a best-selling book based on his work with maltreated children, and Born for Love: Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. Dr. Perry's most recent book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing, co-authored with Oprah Winfrey, is a #1 New York Times bestseller. Dr. Perry, it is truly an honor to have you with us today to support our community in coming together in the spirit of healing. Welcome.
Um, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you a little bit about some of our work, and I'm hopeful that some of the things I talk about will be useful as each of you thinks about what's been going on over the last couple of years, and really how do we move forward from here in a way that's going to help us in some ways restore and for many people help us heal. Um, I do a lot of work and have for many years trying to understand how experiences influence the body and the brain. And a lot of our focus has been on how bad experiences influence the functioning of different systems in our body and our brain. And one of the things that we've learned is that stress is something that is an inevitable and universal part of life. And everybody has stress every day of some form. Um, but there are times when the quantity of stress, the duration, the pattern of these stressful experiences can overload our systems, and it makes us vulnerable to physical exhaustion and mental exhaustion and other issues and problems, which I'll talk about in a minute. But what I like to do for about 45 minutes is talk a little bit about what we're learning about uh, stress, vulnerability, resilience, and do it in context of the experiences your community has been having over the last couple of years. And to do that, I'm going to have to use some slides. So bear with me for 1 second, and I'm going to show you my screen. Now, I just a heads up, I have had a couple of times in the last month where my slides have crashed on Zoom. I hope that won't happen, but I think I'm going to keep most of my presentation open like this. Hopefully you'll be able to see the main slide I'm talking about. The key, again, just to reemphasize what I was saying earlier, stress is something that we all experience. And I really, I have to say, being somebody who was in sport, being somebody who appreciates the challenges of education, somebody who's a parent, I've always recognized, and both academically and personally, that stress is not necessarily a bad thing. That challenging a system in your body by pushing it can actually make that system get stronger. And this is one of the most important things about, I think, understanding the way forward, is that not all stress is bad. In fact, if you're able to create an environment where the stressors that you have are predictable, where they're not too intense, they're moderate, and there's some element of control, that pattern of stress activation actually leads to healing if you're dysregulated and sensitized, and leads to resilience if you're neurotypically organized. And I'll talk you through that a little bit more in a minute. But the key is the goal of healing And the goal of becoming resilient isn't to avoid stress. It's to understand how to dose and space stress, how to manage the stress you have in your life. And everybody, as I said before, has some degree of inevitability to the stressors that they experience. People have to go to work. People are going to, get it. There's going to be traffic. There are going to be interpersonal challenges with your children, with your spouse, with the people you know. You cannot avoid stress, and you shouldn't avoid stress. But the key is understanding the pattern of stress and recognizing that prolonged stress is literally capable of wearing you out. And I think one of the things that everybody's been experiencing in the last, 6 months, about a year into the COVID pandemic, is how exhausted they are. I don't think I've talked to really anybody who feels like they have the same level of energy, the same focus, the same capacity to problem solve that they had 18 months ago. And this is particularly more challenging for any individual or any community that has been impacted by other significant stressors on top of the pandemic. And so let's just take a look at some of the things that have happened in your community. Dr. Talamantes was very kind to put together this timeline of a few of the sort of national and county-wide experiences that would predictably cause stress and distress for many people, and significant trauma for large groups of people in your county. Going back to July in 2019, there was the mass shooting, and COVID started, and then the issues with George Floyd, and COVID continued and got worse, and there were wildfires, and COVID continued, and there's all of the political chaos and distress, and the terrible VTA mass shooting 1 month ago, and now you're facing the challenges and the stressors and unknowns related to reopening. So the truth is, it's probably extremely difficult to find somebody in your community, in your county, who hasn't been directly impacted by one or more of these events in ways that are significantly influencing the way they function. And part of what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the basics of how we handle stress, and then move over to thinking about what the implications of this are for our systems, and whether or not there are some concrete systemic actions that can be taken to continue to learn together, to plan together, and to anticipate ways forward that are both healing and resilience building. So let me just start with this. Everybody, I'm fortunate that I have a lot of good friends and colleagues that are part of the Santa Clara community. I've worked closely with Dr. Christy Brandt, and I've spent time working with Sherry and Rachel, and there are lots of other clinicians and educators and other people who are aware of the way we do our work in our working group. And one of the things that we try to understand is how the brain and the biology of the brain can help us understand human beings. And again, I don't want anybody to feel like I'm not trying to make you neuroscientists, but I do think that there's just a few simple principles about the way your brain is organized and about the way your brain is going to function under stress will be helpful for you to understand what's been going on in your life as a result of some of the experiences you've been having in the last couple of years. So the first thing is this simple upside down triangle model we use all the time. And this is our effort to try to capture some of the complexity of the brain and illustrate a couple of key points. First key point is that the brain is organized in a hierarchy. So there's a top part of the brain, the cortex, and then there's a bottom part of the brain. And this is most people have probably heard of the brainstem. And so all of these parts of the brain are interconnected, and they are seamlessly organized and integrated in a very complex way. But the key thing I want to get across here is that at the top part of your brain are all of these capabilities that are most uniquely human. The capacity for speech and language, the capacity to store and create and modify your beliefs about and worldview, your capacity to tell time, to reflect on the past and to anticipate the future. All of your linear narrative recollection and memory of your own personal life is stored up in this part of your brain. And so this is the most uniquely human part of us. The issue with the cortex, however, is that it's exquisitely sensitive to stress. The accessibility, the availability, your capacity to do these uniquely human things is vulnerable to stress and distress. And so if you understand a little bit about the stress neurobiology, that'll become a little bit more apparent. And what I want to, again, I'm not going to try to make you all neuroscientists, but I think my next slide, as busy as it is, should help you understand a couple of important things. Now, many of you, maybe not all, but many of you have heard of the adverse childhood experience studies, the ACE studies. And those studies basically were looked at the history of adversities, bad things that happened in the development of adults, what happened to you when you were a child up to age 18. And then they correlated the presence of these adversities with your physical health, your mental health, your social functioning, and a whole bunch of other areas of functioning. And what they found was basically the more adversities, the more bad things you had experienced in childhood and youth, the more vulnerable you were as an adult for physical health, mental health problems. And the reason that is true is that stress and distress during development literally caused changes in a set of really important systems in your body, in your brain, that we'll refer to as your core regulatory networks, CRN. Now, the reason these core regulatory networks are so important is that they literally go everywhere in your brain. They reach everywhere in your brain, and they can influence every single brain-mediated function. Thinking, feeling, behaving, moving, everything is influenced by these core regulatory networks. Furthermore, these core regulatory networks influence directly all of the other organs in your body through the autonomic nervous system, which are basically our nerves that go from your brain out to your body, and also indirectly through hormones, through the neuroendocrine system and through your immune system. And so all kinds of physiological systems that are involved in keeping you healthy are influenced by the activity of these core regulatory networks, which are basically the backbone of the stress response. Now, in order to monitor all of the systems in your body and monitor all of the challenges in the external world, we have our senses that are monitoring the outside world, and we have interoceptive mechanisms, which are basically internal sensory apparatus that tell this part of the brain what's going on inside your body and what's going on outside of your body. So continually, these really important networks, these core regulatory networks that I've been talking about that go everywhere in your body and brain, and influence the way you think, feel, behave, move, and function physically, these networks are continually getting input from the outside world. And one of the key things that you should understand is, and I'm going to take a risk here. Hopefully this won't crash my PowerPoint presentation. But what we know is that if you take a person and they experience a stressor, and that comes in and it's processed, and the first part of the brain that gets to see the threat is the lower part of the brain. And that activates these core regulatory networks, which then recruit other systems in the brain to help you respond to the threat. And it helps you survive that moment. So certain parts of the brain need to get activated when you're under threat, and certain parts of the brain you don't need. Now, it's interesting that the systems that are the first to get shut down or deactivated when you're threatened are the systems that are at the top part of your brain. And these are the systems that are concerned about the future and the past, the systems that are involved in abstract cognition, in reflection, and all kinds of things that are really quite uniquely human. So oddly enough, the more threatened you get, the more you become like other species in your response to threat. You focus on the present moment. You shut down your capacity for abstract cognition. You literally have a central nervous system that will be much less responsive to all kinds of aspects of problem solving that would typically be the domain of the top part of your brain. And again, a consequence of this is that you essentially have some systems that are more active and a lot of systems that are less active. Now, let me take a moment and change slides. Sorry, got to go back to sharing my screen. Just thought I'd say hi. Hi, everybody. I'm going to go back to my slides. Here we are. I pushed the wrong button. I meant to push this button. Now, so when this stress response system is activated, one of the first things that'll take place is that you start to shut down parts of your brain and you start to activate other parts of your brain. And when this happens in a specific way, it happens with a significant duration. In other words, these systems get activated in these extreme ways that are prolonged or in patterns that are unpredictable. It changes the normal stress reactivity curve. Now, this is your stress reactivity curve. Basically, what we're trying to illustrate here is that as you start to experience a little bit of a challenge down here, if you're neurotypically organized, what will happen is there'll be a tiny little bit of activation and your cortex will still be open for business, and you'll recruit systems in your brain that'll help you solve that problem. But you won't be completely overwhelmed. But if you've had chronic distress, if you've had all kinds of challenging things happen to you in the past, and your stress response systems have become sensitized, when you're faced with a minor stressor, you'll literally feel overwhelmed. And your brain will basically act as if a minor challenge is a major threat. Now, this becomes a huge problem if you are trying to function as a child in school. It becomes a big problem if you're trying to function as an employee in a workplace. It becomes a problem if you're trying to function in a relationship with your spouse. You're overactive and overly reactive. You're basically tuned out, and you are either going to blow up or shut down. Either way, it's a less than optimal way to deal with stress. And again, you're neurotypically organized. Here you are, prior to COVID, you're neurotypically organized. You have a moderate challenge. You can meet that moderate challenge with a moderate internal activation. The challenge is over. You get back to baseline. 2 weeks later, you have another moderate challenge. There's adequate space between these moderate challenges so that you don't change your baseline. But COVID starts, and all of a sudden, you find yourself experiencing patterns of activation that are unpredictable, uncontrollable, sometimes extreme. The people experienced the VTA shooting had extreme and prolonged activation. Prior to that, they had all kinds of unpredictable changes in their lives. Changes about school, changes about shopping, changes about masks, changes about going to work, not going to work, changes about how you do your work, all kinds of chronic, unpredictable stuff. And then along comes a major challenge. And part of what's happened to the community globally is that if you took the population regulatory state, I'm going to make the assumption, maybe it's not fair, but that's globally speaking, Santa Clara County was a pretty regulated place. Lots of people held down jobs, lots of people, lots of community engagement, lots of positive things happened. But once you start taking any community, either think about a family, think about an individual, but you think about a county, and you start to have some of these experiences, you're starting to essentially create a pattern of stress activation that is unpredictable, extreme, uncontrollable, and the baseline level of regulation of people in that county starts to rise. And it can continue, and it can continue. Now, I would suspect that if you went to a county that didn't have 2 mass shootings, you'd probably have a curve that's going to start to look like this. They're going to be able to get back down to here faster than a county that's having to deal with these mass shootings. A mass shooting has profound impact on the families that are directly impacted by the loss of a loved one, by the people who witnessed it, by the first responders who had to go and wade through all of the horrible carnage, by the mental health team that had to go in and feel helpless while they were trying to support and sustain these families. They're the ones who are experts, are supposed to know everything, but they're standing around looking at, what the hell do I do? How do you comfort somebody who's weeping about the loss of a loved one after a senseless shooting? And so the echo of this event has repercussions that last a long time. And so I would argue, and I may be wrong, but I would argue that if you look at globally, many, many, many people in your county are feeling pretty tapped out. Now, here's the good news. These, where you are as a community, basically speaking, with regards to your regulatory status, is something that's changeable. This is not in the same way that experiences of stress and distress and trauma that are uncontrollable can cause an elevation in the global regulatory status of the county, so too can experiences that are controllable, predictable, lead to improvement. So here's the good news. If you have an individual who is dysregulated, who is up in this place, they've had a history of trauma, if you give that individual opportunities for controllable, appropriately spaced, smaller regulatory doses of challenge, their baseline level of arousal will ultimately get to the point where they're neurotypically regulated. And if you keep doing that, if they continue to have experiences that are moderate and controllable and predictable, that begin to overcome the number of experiences that are uncontrollable, extreme, and prolonged, they can return to a state of good regulation. Now, this is not an easy thing to do, but it's not an impossible thing to do. But here's the thing I'm going to tell everybody in a position of leadership and authority. This is not a thing that you can do by simply talking about it. You can't have a class and make people develop resilience. You develop resilience by having real experiences. And part of what I want to talk about for a minute are the kinds of things that lead to shifts and changes in individual and group regulatory status. So let's go back to this. Here's the basic principle. Experiences that are predictable, moderate, and controllable lead to these good patterns. Experiences that are unpredictable, extreme, or prolonged either maintain or create a sensitizing pattern. And so if you are an individual like me, who is lucky enough to be born into an environment where I was part of the mainstream culture and ethnicity, and I had safe and stable family and community, and I had good, secure housing and income and meaningful work, all of these things led to a more predictable, moderate experiences than others. This is what privilege is. I was privileged. And I would argue that many of the people that work in our county systems have some element of resilience that's related to either cultural connection or secure income or meaningful work or secure housing or good relationships. This is where you were prior to COVID. And by and large, we were working with people who were not as lucky as we were, who weren't as privileged. We're working with individuals who have to deal with, historically and in the present, poverty, homelessness, unemployment, racism, all of these things, these adversities made them more vulnerable. And so here we were trying to take our strengths and our resilience capabilities and help individuals who have challenges. And that's hard. But here's the problem. Here's our pre-COVID baseline. I think after COVID and after the last 2 years, even your superheroes, even the strongest of you, the most resilient of you, after going through all of this is where you are. It's not bad, but you're not as strong as you used to be. You're not as capable of dealing with as many stressors or as extreme. You've had decision fatigue. You've got analysis paralysis, all of the things that are stressors in normal life, you're having a harder time managing. The rate of change in decisions within county agencies and organizations is higher than it was pre-COVID because you're having to make all kinds of decisions. And the ability to make those decisions quickly is being compromised. At the same time that the needs of the families that we're working with, the pre-COVID needs of these families that we're trying to deal with, which were here, are now here. Now, this is not an unaddressable set of problems. It is addressable. But if you, as a community, and I think that I just want to be really clear, this presentation is part of an intentional process put in place by leadership in this county to begin to create a resilience building pattern around the process of addressing the trauma from the shootings, addressing the challenges of COVID, preparing for potential adversities that may face the county. But it is intentional. It's an intentional process that's going to take time. Now, there's a couple things that are going to be really important in that. When organizations, and I'll see if I can find it here, when organizations start to think about becoming a regulated organization, and again, I'm speaking there, I know that there are participants on this call that come from many sub-organizations, but let me just think about this as a whole. One of the things that's going to be really important for your community to begin to address some of these issues will be to begin to be intentional about bringing aspects of controllability, aspects of predictability, and aspects of moderation into the problem-solving process of your system. And what this means is you got to talk with each other better. This process, this talk, this 1 hour presentation is just the beginning of what will be a multi-pronged county-wide process to try to understand, address, and problem solve with people who have been impacted by the shooting, with people who've been impacted by COVID, with people who've been impacted by other forms of adversity that are having pervasive impact on the county or individual impact on a family or a person. But the goal is to create organizational mechanisms to respond, as opposed to throw a little bit of information. The spray and pray approach that a lot of counties do is to say, hey, self-care is good, go take care of yourself, learn how to do breathing and yoga. There's no amount of yoga that can undo what's happened to your community in the last 2 years. You need to think intentionally about proactive, predictable, controllable, moderate elements that you can bring back into the workplace and into the community that will help create that healing pattern. And there are lots of ways to do it. I mean, you know, the good news is that your county has got all kinds of folks who are aware of development. And really what you're going through in all of these different systems is a form of development. You're going through organizational transitions. And just like individual development, all organizational transitions involve periods of consolidation and periods of deterioration prior to reorganization. And key things about effective organizational transition involve the pre-transition preparation. And I would argue that this meeting is an intentional form of pre-transition preparation. We have talked about the need to have multiple people in multiple systems get on the same page about understanding stress, distress, trauma, predictability, all these things that I'm throwing out there. Following this meeting, there's going to be conversations about how to have more public offerings to bring groups together to talk about what is healing, what are our challenges, what would help me, what I do want, what I don't want. And I think one of the biggest challenges in responding to large community events like the VTA shooting is that there's a fantasy out there in the mental health world that we can come in with a one-size-fits-all approach. What do you do after the reality is there are hundreds of little things that you need to do because there are hundreds of people who are impacted. Each of them has a different perspective, a different point of view, a different set of needs, a different set of strengths. And if you put in place a structure and a process to get to know these people and listen to them, and then have a multiple tools in your toolkit, which you do, your county's got lots of tools. The key is when you use which tool. There might be some kids that will respond well to certain kinds of interventions. There might be some adults that will respond best to having an opportunity to talk with somebody. There might be some people within a system who recognize and would appreciate the intentional process of setting up a proactive set of communication strategies to be used the next time there is a large-scale event. The sense of helplessness that is present in many organizations and individuals following these experiences, is something that is rarely addressed, but needs to be talked about.
Dr. Perry, here is our first question. I am observing a parallel between Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how higher cognitive ability and awareness is impacted when we are in survival mode. Could you discuss this further and identify how people can address longer-term survival needs?
And I think that observation is spot on, that, a lot of times we're trying to address some higher order cognitive need of a person without meeting their fundamental regulatory needs or connecting with them. We have a sort of a heuristic that we use when we're trying to help people understand some of this stuff, and we refer to it as the sequence of engagement. And basically what it is it's recognizing that before you can get to this higher order cognitive capability and reason with somebody in any meaningful way, you have to first connect with them. There has to be some relational connection. And that before you can have any sort of a useful, sustained relational connection, there has to be some fundamental regulatory capability. The person has to be regulated to at least some minimal degree. So if you have a full bladder and you're sleep deprived and you're scared and you're angry, you're not going to be able to effectively connect with somebody, and they're not going to be able to hear the rational things that you have to say. So it is very much along the lines of Maslow's hierarchy, that right now for many people, before we can have any higher order cognitive conversation about things, they need to feel like they belong. They need to feel connected. They need to be seen. They need to be valued. And a huge part of that is they need to be heard. And so there are going to be a lot of angry people. There are going to be a lot of sad people, a lot of frustrated people, and they need to be heard. And they need to be connected with. And then after they're connected with and regulated, then the reasoning part of the process can take place. But I think, so often I think that with good intentions, we violate that that sequence of engagement, and we do a lot of work to make ourselves feel better, but it has no real positive impact on the person that we're interacting with. And a lot of times, just to be polite, they just shut down and they just listen to whatever blather we're saying, and it doesn't make any change. And we think that we've had some impact, and we really have done nothing. But that's exactly what we're trying to talk about with state-dependent functioning here. Sorry about my throat. So when you feel safe and regulated, you can use your cortex. And when you're sort of stressed and overwhelmed and distressed, you just shut down. And that what really happens with individuals is that the further you move down, the more you're dysregulated, the more lower parts of the brain are in control of your functioning. And so your capacity to sort of reflect is diminished. And ultimately, you just get down into this sort of frozen paralytic state where you're compliant and you do whatever you're told to do, but you don't really make any positive change. And the same thing happens, and I don't know if I have it in here, but the same thing is true of organizations, that any system that is resource limited and it has lots of unpredictability and novelty, the group IQ, drops. And again, I think this is kind of speaking to your point, Norman.
Our next question. I am trying to understand more about the resilience building pattern idea. How do we manage the demands that we need to be responsive to while thinking about predictable forward planning?
I, I the I think your point. Let me talk a tiny little bit more about that pattern. Part of the challenge with that pattern is that what is a moderate challenge for one person is not a moderate challenge for another person. And so here's the key message to everybody who's a supervisor or a leader. What you could reasonably expect from your workforce prior to all of this was much higher than what you can reasonably expect now. A moderate challenge for somebody who is in your work, who you supervise, is going to be a smaller dose of work, and they need more space to recover from it. And that's because their stress reactivity curve has shifted. And so, again, I think the question is really spot on about what is the right dose of stress. A resilience building moderate and predictable dose varies obviously by developmental age, but it also varies by the reactivity and sensitivity of the individual stress response. So if you've got people who prior to COVID were very well regulated, and what you're going to find is now that they're burned out and tired out, the amount of work you can expect from them in the same amount of time is less. And so as a leader, what you really need to do is take stuff off their plate. And you need to give them more doses, more time to recover. And this is really, I've said this a million times, we need to slow down. The rate at which we're doing our work needs to slow down. And hi, John. There's my buddy, John. Sorry. But I think the major mistake most places are making in education and in really all of the health and human service settings that I'm working with, now that people are immunized and now that the rates are getting a little bit less, there's this idea that we now have the energy that we had prior to the event, prior to all of this. And so there's like full speed ahead. And it really is a mistake. It's a huge mistake. If we really want to have a resilience building experience over the next 6 months, we literally have to make people take their vacation days. We have to start work on time. We have to make sure people leave the office at 5. We need to make sure they take lunch. We need to make sure that we don't take on any new challenges. I've actually told places that want to get certified in the NMT, for example, that no, you're not. This is not the time to take on a system-wide shift in the way you do your work. You need to basically, we can do a little bit of light touch introduction to the concepts, but to dedicate 150 hours of time over this next year to learning a new model is crazy. Just don't do it. Don't do it unless that's going to be their job. Don't do it unless you take something else off their plate. Don't add more to their plate. And unfortunately, I think what's been happening is that, people are having more added to their plate. They have their regular job, and then now they're asked to be part of the committee that helps redesign the new way that we do work. That let's reflect on the last year. What should we do? What shouldn't we do? How much should we? It's like, this is not the time to do a lot of thinking, honestly. You need to do some rest before you reflect. And I think that hasn't been happening for most systems that we work with.
This is our final question. We have been impacted by so much already with COVID. The active shooting has put many of us in a complete state of overwhelm. What can we do to deal with this overwhelm and with the fear of returning to or being at work?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing it. My heart goes out to you. I can't, the work that you do at baseline is hard to do. But then to have all this other stuff on top of it, it's got to be pretty overwhelming. So here's, now this isn't directly addressing what you're asking, but this might give you some ideas about this. It's completely normal that you feel overwhelmed by this. It's not at all surprising. And I suspect many other people feel the same way. But one of the things that we've learned is that, again, it's very much like this dosing and spacing thing, is that if you have a process that's very slow and very dosed, where you have progressive exposure to the thing that you're afraid of. Let's say that going to work feels overwhelming. If you literally just, and I'm going to just throw this out there, if you drive to the building where you would be working and you sit in your car and you have somebody come out and talk with you for 5 minutes and just touch base, and then you go back home and work from home. And the next day you come in and you take one step out of the car. And then the next day you come and you take 2 steps out of the car. And if that's too overwhelming, then the next day you come back and take 1 step out of the car. But the idea is that you want your brain, which made appropriate sort of generalizations to threat based upon what happened from the shooting, you want to ultimately make the places in your community and in your workplace become appropriately in your head safe. And the way to make them safe is by gradual dosing of exposure and with the scaffolding of somebody you feel safe with. So if it's a supervisor, if it's a coworker, if it's your partner, when they help you do this, little by little by little, your brain can start to desensitize to the evocative images, evocative experience of being in the workplace. We did this with kids after 9/11, where originally there was the idea that these kids after 9/11 shouldn't go back to school in lower Manhattan because just going to the place is evocative. And I said, no, they need to go back. They should go back as soon as possible. It's going to be painful. It's going to be distressing, but they need to go back and just for a little while and then come back for half an hour. And then the next 2 days later, come back for, an hour. And when they're there, they should be with people that they feel safe with, and they should do something that's fun. And over time, ultimately, they got to the point where they realized my school is safe. It was the Twin Towers that fell down. What my school isn't what caused these problems. And so that's the kind of thing that I think there needs to be lots of flexibility about helping people begin to feel safe again. And again, I'm sure you're speaking for lots of people who feel just overwhelmed by this because, first of all,
Dr. Perry, for those of us who cannot come back to work slowly or are already back at work, what do you suggest?
first of all, you clearly are dedicated to the work. This is something that you should be helped with. All the people that you work with should be helped through this process. It should be done in a transitional way. I think the problem solving could be done in a lot of different ways. It might even involve a different building, a different way to do stuff. I mean, I don't know enough about the situation, but I can guarantee you that if you all think about this, there will be ways to make this an easier transition. Listen, and don't be hard on yourself. This is, you're doing heroic work considering the circumstances.
Please visit the website for the County of Santa Clara Behavioral Health Services Department for information on community resources, including the Behavioral Health Call Center, which is the entry point for Santa Clara County Behavioral Health Services. Santa Clara County Behavioral Health Services provides support for individuals and families who are in crisis, considering suicide, or struggling with mental health, mental illness, and/or substance use needs. The Behavioral Health Services Suicide and Crisis Hotline provides 24-hour confidential phone intervention for individuals experiencing different form of crises, emotional or situation distress, or a need for general information or referrals. The Mobile Crisis Response Team, MCRT, provides immediate phone intervention and clinicians that can respond in person if an immediate crisis response is needed. The National Disaster Distress Helpline is a 24/7 line that provides counseling and support to people experiencing emotional distress related to a natural or human-caused disaster. Your employer's Employee Assistance Program may also be a resource for counseling and support. Most health plans include access to behavioral health supports. Contact the Member Services number for your health plan to inquire further. Also, anytime you or a loved one is experiencing a mental health emergency, you can call 911 for a law enforcement response. Most law enforcement agencies co-respond to mental health emergencies with a mental health clinician or a trained crisis intervention team member.